Overview of Analytical Psychology. An early colleague of Freud, Carl Gustav Jung, broke from orthodox psychoanalysis to establish a separate theory of personality called analytical psychology, which rests on the assumption that occult phenomena can and do influence the lives of everyone. Jung believed that each of us is motivated not only by repressed experiences but also by certain emotionally thrown experiences inherited by our ancestor. These inherited images make up what Jung called the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious includes those elements that we have never experienced individually but which have come down to us from our ancestor. Some elements of collective unconscious become highly developed and are called archetypes. The most inclusive archetype is the notion of self-realization, which can be achieved only by attaining a balance between various opposing forces of personality. Thus, Jung's theories come to be of opposite people are both introverted and extroverted, rational and irrational, male and female, conscious and unconscious, and pushed by past events while being pulled by future expectations. Levels of psych: conscious, personal unconscious, collective unconscious, archetypes. Conscious. According to Jung, conscious images are those that are sensed by the ego, whereas unconscious elements have no relationship with the ego. Jung's notion of ego is more restrictive than Freud. Jung saw the ego as the center of consciousness, but not the core of personality. Personal unconscious. The personal unconscious embraces all the repressed, forgotten, or subliminally perceived experiences of one particular individual. It contains repressed infantile memories and impulses, forgotten events, and experiences originally perceived below the threshold of our consciousness. Collective unconscious. In contrast to the personal unconscious, which result from individual experiences, the collective unconscious has rooted the ancestral past of the entire species. It represents Jung's most controversial and perhaps his most distinctive concept. The physical contents of the collective unconscious are inherited in the past from one generation to the next as physic potential. Archetypes. Archetypes are ancient or archaic images that derive from the collective unconscious. They are similar to complexes in that they are emotionally toned collections of associate images. But whereas complexes are individualized components of the personal unconscious, archetypes are generalized and derived from the contents of the collective unconscious. Archetypes should also be distinguished from instinct. Archetypes: persona, shadow, anima, animus, great mother, wise old man, hero, self.
Persona. The side of personality that people show to the world is designated as the persona. Shadow, the shadow, the archetype of darkness and repression, represent those qualities we do not wish to acknowledge but attempt to hide from ourselves and others. Anima, like Freud, Jung believed that all humans are psychologically bisexual and possess both a masculine and a feminine side. The feminine side of men originates in the collective unconscious as an archetype and remains extremely resistant to consciousness. Animus. The masculine archetype in woman is called the animus, whereas the anima represents irrational moods and feelings. The animus is symbolic of thinking and reasoning. Great Mother. Two other archetypes, the Great Mother and the Wise Old Man, are derivatives of the anima and animus. Everyone, man or woman, possesses a Great Mother archetype. This pre-existing concept of mother is always associated with both positive and negative feelings. Wise Old Man. The Wise Old Man, archetype of wisdom and meaning, symbolizes human pre-existing knowledge of the mystery of life.
Hero. The origin of the hero motif goes back to earliest human history to the dawn of consciousness. In conquering the villain, the hero is symbolically overcoming the darkness of pre-human unconsciousness. Self. Jung believed that each person possesses an inherited tendency to move toward growth, perfection, and completion, and he called this innate disposition the self.
Dynamics of personality. Causality and teleology. Progression and regression. Causality and teleology. Causality holds that present events have their origin in previous experiences. Teleology holds that present events are motivated by goals and aspirations for the future that direct a person's destiny.
Progression and regression. To achieve self-realization, people must adapt not only to their outside environment but to their inner world as well. Adaptation to the outside world involves the forward flow of psychic energy and is called progression, whereas adaptation to the inner world relies on a backward flow of psychic energy and is called regression.
Attitudes. Introversion, extroversion. Introversion. Introversion is a turning inward of psychic energy with an orientation toward the subjective. Introverts are tuned into their inner world with all its biases, fantasies, dreams, and individualized perceptions.
Extraversion. Extraversion is the attitude distinguished by the turning outward of psychic energy so that a person is oriented toward the objective and away from the subjective. Extroverts are more influenced by their surroundings than by their inner world. They tend to focus on the objective attitude while suppressing the subjective.
Functions: thinking, feeling, sensing, intuiting. Thinking. Logical intellectual activity that produces a chain of ideas is called thinking.
Feeling. Jung used the term feeling to describe the process of evaluating an idea or event. Perhaps a more accurate word would be valuing, a term less likely to be confused with either sensing or intuiting. Sensing. The function that receives physical stimuli and transmits them to perceptual consciousness is called sensation. Sensing is not identical to the physical stimulus but is simply the individual's perception of sensory impulses. Intuiting. Intuition involves perception beyond the workings of consciousness. Development of personality. Stages of development. Childhood, youth, middle life, old age. Childhood, the anarchic phase, the monarchic phase, the dualistic phase. The anarchic phase is characterized by chaotic and sporadic consciousness. The monarchic phase of childhood is characterized by the development of the ego and by the beginning of logical and verbal thinking. The ego as perceiver arises during the dualistic phase of childhood, when the ego is divided into the objective and subjective. Youth. The period from puberty until middle life is called youth. Young people strive to gain psychic and physical independence from their parents, find a mate, raise a family, and make a place in the world. Middle life. Middle life begins at approximately age 35 or 40, by which time the sun has passed its zenith and begins its downward descent. Although this decline can present middle-aged people with increasing anxieties, middle life is also a period of tremendous potential. Old age. As the evening of life approaches, people experience a diminution of consciousness, just the light and warmth of the sun diminish at dusk. If people fear life during the early years, then they will almost certainly fear death during the later ones. Self-realization, psychological revert, also called self-realization or individuation, is the process of becoming an individual or whole person. Self-realization is extremely rare and is achieved only by people who are able to assimilate the unconscious into their total personality. Jung's methods of investigation. Word association test, dream analysis, active imagination, psychotherapy. Word association test. Jung was not the first to use the word association test, but he can be credited with helping develop and refine it. Dream analysis. Jung agreed with Freud that dreams have meaning and that they should be taken seriously. He also agreed with Freud that dreams spring from the depths of the unconscious and that their latent meaning is expressed in symbolic form. Active imagination, a technique Jung used during his own self-analysis as well as with many of his patients, was active imagination. This method requires a person to begin with any impression, a dream image, vision, picture, or fantasy, and to concentrate until their impression begins to move. The person must follow these images to wherever they lead and then courageously face these autonomous images and freely communicate with them. Psychotherapy, representing four developmental stages in the history of psychotherapy. The first is confession of a pathogenic secret. The second stage involves interpretation, explanation, and elucidation. The third stage, therefore, is the approach adopted by Adler and includes the education of patients as social beings. Unfortunately, says Jung, this approach often leaves patients merely socially well adjusted. To go beyond these three approaches, Jung suggested a fourth stage, transformation. By transformation, he meant that the therapist must first be transformed into a healthy human being, preferably by undergoing psychotherapy.